Sandra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad that you were here. It was kind of like I was talking about your book on the Kids Ministry Circle Instagram, and you responded to me, and I was like, wait, I didn't even know that you followed. Like, you were on my list to try and dig through Google to find your email. And it just so happened that you DM'd me, and I was so excited because I was like, oh, I need to have you come on the podcast. And so I'm so glad that you are here. Your new book, Accessible Church, a gospel centered vision for including people with disabilities and their families. One, it's beautiful. Like, the cover is so pretty on the outside.
Thank
But
you.
just as I've dug into the book, I've loved it. We were chatting at the beginning before we hit record about how this is kind of an area of ministry and really just life that I feel like kids ministry leaders feel really nervous about. They don't know what to say all the time. They don't have the right answers. Most kids ministry leaders did not go to school to learn about things like this. And so anytime a new book comes out that can be a resource for kids ministry leaders and ministry leaders at large, I'm always so grateful because I'm still learning in so many different ways. So I'm excited that you're here. I'm super grateful for your book. Before we jump into all the conversation that we're going to have today, why don't you give our listeners a brief overview of who you are and maybe how you kind of entered into this world of ministry?
Okay, great. I grew up with a sister with Down syndrome. And so the churches that I had been a part of growing up were all accessible to her, which meant they were accessible to our entire family. And I kind of took that for granted until our son was diagnosed with autism back in 2010. And my husband is a pastor. And we were serving a church in Pennsylvania at the time, and it was, a church of about 125, 150 people. And we got James's diagnosis, and we kind of looked around and we said, "Oh, well, there's no other special needs families here." And that means we're not taking the steps that would help them feel welcome. And so
Mm.
I was kind of the catalyst for what I do. So that's what I've been doing since then. I now serve the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention as their disability ministry consultant. So I get to help churches all across the state either start disability ministries or strengthen their existing disability ministries. I am a PhD student at Southwestern Seminary in the area of family ministry. And so I get to take all these classes and learn what all these children's ministers know about childhood development and caring for volunteers and all those important topics. And so I kind of bring in my disability ministry experience into that. Right now, we live outside of Houston. My husband pastors a different church now. We spent a couple years in church planting, so we were kind of in that season of having to be in either the church meeting at our house or meeting in an elementary school or all those kind of different scenarios. And so my specialty really is inclusion in normal sized churches because it looks different in each church size.
Hmm.
But because of my experiences in small to normal sized churches, that's where it's kind of my sweet spot. That's where I like to speak into and encourage, because this really falls to children's ministers at churches
Right.
of that size. They're trying to figure out how to make their ministries inclusive and serve more families, as opposed to some of our big churches that have like a separate disability ministry that's their own kind of silo. So
Hmm.
I have such a heart for everything that children's ministers get to do and the ways that they get to serve and the creativity that they have. And so it's just always so much fun to get to hang out with you and other leaders and learn and also hopefully encourage.
Yes. Yes. That's awesome. I love that. And I think the difference between, like you said, the bigger churches who do have people on staff and an entire ministry that helps both kids and adults feel included and feel welcome and create a space where they can feel this sense of belonging is so incredible. But like you said, most churches don't have the budget, don't have the space, and don't have the resources to have an entire separate ministry. And so I do think speaking to that average size church, the normal size church of like, no, you can still do this. You can still be inviting and welcoming and create a space where all families can belong and hear the story of the gospel. And so I love that. As we jump into our conversation, one thing I like to do when we're talking about disability ministry is just help our community kind of define the terms. I know that terms change, and you even wrote at the beginning of your book of like, this book was written in this time and terms may change. And so there's like, you want to look at the heart behind what you're saying, not necessarily the term that may or may not be the correct term in that specific season. And so, will you just give us an insight on like, what is, as of right now, fall of 2025, what are some of the terms that people are using that this community likes the most? And what's the most common phrases, just so that like in this conversation, I can use the right terms and then people can kind of go out from there and use the right, most welcoming terms.
Yeah, this is a great question because we are literally in a transition period right now of this language.
Okay.
And so so even I mean you get like 10 disability ministry leaders in a room and we may use all different language
Right.
because we're just at different parts of transitioning. So the disability community, so adults with disabilities, don't love the special needs language. So
Okay.
their argument for that is they say, well, our needs aren't that special, right? We have the same needs that everybody else has. But you have younger families or families that are new to this population or their kids are just getting a new diagnosis. They might be a little bit afraid of the term disability, like they're picturing it as physical disabilities or
Mhm.
something that's very different. So they're still more likely to use special needs ministry, all of that. It's so there isn't a right or wrong right now.
Okay.
There's a preferred by certain populations. On like our church website, we use both. So we make sure that we're kind of capturing both. I think that we even call ours like an inclusive, accessible ministry, inclusive ministry. You can use kind of those terms because you that way you feel like you're kind of drawing a wider net. The
Mhm.
neurodiverse community, which that's kids and adults with autism, ADHD, though we call them invisible disabilities. So they're
Right.
on that neurodiverse spectrum. They're guiding some of this language and how that's being used and changing. So all of these things are kind of coming together right now that make it hard to
Yes.
know what kind of language to use. I think in the future, 5 years, I think we'll all have switched over to disability ministry. That's what
Okay.
I default to. Part of that is because I'm on social media. I'm talking to big
Yeah.
crowds and like if I post language that isn't preferred on Twitter/X, I'm gonna hear about it,
Oh,
right? But
yeah.
you, as a local children's minister, would be less likely to hear any pushback. So if you're
Yeah.
talking to a family, my suggestion is just use the language they use. If they
Right.
use special needs, you use special needs. If they use neurodiverse, you use if they use disability, like just kind of echo back to them what they're using. We certainly don't want to correct a family and say
Right.
you're using
Yeah.
outdated language or
Right.
because they're on this journey too of like learning a whole new language and navigating a diagnosis. And so we don't want to do anything that heaps stress or shame on them. But like if
Mhm.
you are talking about the ministry at your church, you could use something like accessible ministry, inclusive opportunities, disability ministry, special needs ministry. Any of those right now could be applicable.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And kind of on that same conversation, when ministries are creating some sort of a program, whether that's a buddy program or a ministry that specifically is for this disability community, do you recommend calling it what it is? Or a lot of churches are like, we have the VIP ministry or whatever, they call it something different. Where do you stand on that? Do you want people to call it a special needs ministry, or do you recommend having another name that is not as explicit?
Yeah, I think a big question to ask yourself when you're thinking about this is if you're targeting unreached, unchurched families and say
Mhm.
say you have a cute name, say you have
Right.
like I mean, I hate to like pick on any name because they're all cute, but say you do like through the roof because in Mark
Oh,
2
yeah.
the friends
Oh, that's
bring
right.
the friend through the roof. So
Yeah.
your disability ministry is called Through the Roof. Okay, well, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, you don't know
Right.
that Through the Roof is a inclusive, accessible disability ministry, right? So if you do one of those names, just have like a subtitle, Through the Roof
Yeah.
Disability Ministry. Um, whatever it could be, Masterpiece Ministry or Wonderfully Made Ministry, Disability Ministry, like just keep adding special needs
Yeah.
or disability to it because you just kind of want to be thinking how if because lot most special needs families are unchurched families, and
Mhm.
so you're trying to bring in a lost population, and so just kind of think about how you can be clear in your communication
Yeah.
that you're meeting a need that they have, and, so, I mean, you can't go wrong in it. There's no right or wrong answer. I think there's just
Yeah.
kind of best practices and ways that we can put ourselves in somebody else's position and see how they would read it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. That's good. One thing I liked about your book is that you talk very family focused. You talk about the whole family. And I think part of it is probably because this is your family. Like
Yeah.
you grew up in a family like this, are raising a family like this. And so this is very much so your world. And you talk with a very family or family ministry focus. And I think that's helpful for kids ministry leaders to kind of think twofold, right? It's about creating a safe space for kids on Sunday morning or in their midweek programming, but it also is kids ministry leaders and church leaders supporting the whole family and providing different resources for at-home discipleship and all of these different unique things. And so I would love to know from your perspective and as you're talking to ministry leaders, what does family support look like? What are some ways that a kids ministry leader can come alongside a family, even though they may not have personal experience in what the families are navigating and they may not know what the family even needs.
Yeah, this is so helpful because it was because, as I mentioned, like because my church made accommodations for my sister, our whole family was able to attend. And
Mhm.
that didn't happen in every church in the 80s and 90s, right? Like, they didn't even have a formal ministry. They just made accommodations for her, which meant mom and dad and our younger sister and I got to go every Sunday. And so when you are meeting the needs of the kiddo with disabilities, whatever that looks like, you're making a way for the whole family to be there. But these families have some extra challenges
Mhm.
that can change even from the age of the kid. So as the children's ministry person, especially if you're also over preschool ministry, you're kind of the front line when a family gets a diagnosis, right? So
Mhm.
whether that diagnosis like for Down syndrome that came from my parents at birth, we didn't get James's autism diagnosis until he was 3, but we would have relied on somebody from church to kind of show up with us and be there for us. And so, as the children's ministry director, you're kind of there. You're doing those
Mhm.
home visits after a baby's born or after a family welcomes a new child through adoption. You're kind of their first church contact. And so, understanding how to just be there and show up for that family really means a lot. You don't have to have the right answers or say the right thing. You just show up with a promise that you're going to keep showing up and that your
Yeah.
church is going to do their best to keep meeting the needs of this family. And so your presence there in the beginning is really important. Your prayers are important as you pray over them and pray for them. Sometimes your patience is really important. They're going through such a depending on the diagnosis and the timing, but it
Mhm.
none of us are expecting it. I mean, it's such a,
Yeah.
a life altering thing. And sometimes we pull away. We pull away from church or we pull away from there may be ways that we were serving that we can't serve anymore. And so, even if you, as the children's ministry leader, maybe you put a reminder on your phone every 2 weeks, I'm going to check in with this family. Even if they're not responding, I'm going to keep
Mhm.
checking in. I'm going to keep
Yeah.
reminding them that when they're ready, we're going to be here for them and we're going to help them kind of feel acclimated to this life again. So, in the early stages, that's something really helpful. In those like elementary years, junior high years, even beyond, one of the things that we do, kind of a framework that we have, is we ask ourselves, what is hard for this family and how can we make it easier?
Mm.
And so, one thing that's hard for a special needs family is getting a babysitter, right? Like
Right.
you can't always do that. And so we host respite nights at our church 4 times a year. And so that means the special needs families can drop off their kids with a disability and their typical siblings if the siblings want to come. And it just gives mom and dad a date night, or they can go to Walmart by themselves, right? Like they can do whatever they need to do.
Mhm.
And then we even think, like, we had a respite night last weekend. And so we were asking ourselves that question: what is hard for these families? And I thought, well, it's hard for them to decorate for fall, right? Like, it's
Right.
hard for them to go get the mums and the pumpkins and all that. So we went to Walmart and we bought 22 mums and like 30 pumpkins, and we decorated the lobby for respite night. And on their way out, they got to take these mums. Like, we're like, no, take more, take more, take more. Because it just gave them, they didn't have to load their families up and go. They didn't
Yes.
have to spend the money. They didn't have to take the time. So that's just something. Another thing you can do, especially between now and Christmas, one thing that's really hard for special needs families is taking family photos. Like, it's
Yeah.
hard for their families to all behave the
Yes.
way you need to behave. And so we have done, when we were church planting, this is one of the outreaches we did. We got a special education teacher who kind of did photography on the side. So she was super patient. We went to the park on an afternoon. We let families sign up for like 30-minute slots, and they came out and we took their pictures, and then we emailed them all the pictures, and they were able to use those in their Christmas cards and do all that. So, I mean, just kind of that, it doesn't, you don't have to overcomplicate it, but I think that
Right.
question of what might be hard for them that we can make
Mhm.
easier is just a good place to start. And
Yeah.
because there's so many things that are hard, and they rely on us, the church, to be there to kind of fill in some of those gaps for them.
Yeah. I love what you just did, the fall theme, the like, oh, it's hard to go to a pumpkin patch that may not be very inclusive and may like I even think like the gravel in some of our pumpkin patches is like that's not ideal for a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And, like, even just some of those roadblocks that families experience, it's overstimulating, it's often loud. In Texas, it's very hot still,
Yeah.
and that often for all kids, being hot and hungry, I feel like is 2 really
Yeah.
horrible things that can be
2 big
happening.
triggers. Yeah.
And and so just providing that like, that care for them of saying, "Hey, we see you," and it's like, no, all families can still have fun in the fall season and do some of these fun things, and just that question, I feel like is something that people should have in their back pocket all the time of
Yeah.
just, like, what feels hard and how can we help them, and the Christmas card thing is so brilliant. We're literally taking family pictures tonight, and I'm, like,
Oh, wow.
already stressed about it.
Yeah.
And so that is, like, such a sweet way. I'm curious as you like, obviously, your family probably has outside of church, probably has a good community of disability families, of special needs families to where you could do an outreach like that,
Mhm.
where our church is only 3 weeks old. We planted at the beginning of September, and I'm thinking, "Oh, that's such a great idea," but we don't necessarily have the connections to other special needs families in the area, and so I'm curious, like and I mean, this is a very detailed question because in my brain, I'm like, "Well, we're not set up to do an outreach and then say, 'Hey, everybody come on Sunday.' We are meeting in a high school and there's stairs everywhere."
Oh, no. Yeah.
And we do have an elevator, which is nice, but still, there's a ton of stairs. Um, but what does an outreach look like if people are like, we know these people are in our community. We know that there's families who are believing the lie that they're too much for church and that they're too much for the gospel. And we want to invite them in, but we don't necessarily have the connection to the greater community. How have you seen churches connect with that community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it, the good thing about the disability special needs community is that we know each other,
Yeah.
and once we hear a good idea, it really spreads. And so we often have Facebook groups. And so if you have, your town or community, find a disability Facebook group. Here around Houston, we have some that are just for like the county that we're in. So the whole
Okay.
county has one. I do neighboring counties because we're kind of close enough to a county line that
Mhm.
we cross over. So anything our church does, I'm posting it in those groups. There's diagnosis specific groups, right? So there's like Autism Moms of Houston or something like that. So I'm like, okay, here's what we're doing. So those are the way, and we work with our school district. So our school district
Okay.
sends out kind of an email. And if we're doing a respite night, you have to make sure that you're meeting the deadline, that you're wording it in
Mhm.
the way that they're asking you to word it. But our school district has been really good to publicize things for us, like parents, if they do Special Olympics and they're around other like I tell our families, this is your mission field. So when
Yeah.
you are in a waiting room, if you're at Special Olympics, invite them to the church or to the outreaches that we're doing. Any of that would be helpful. But when we were church planting, when we didn't have a building, that's when we did that photography one. We also did sensory friendly movies. And so we would kind of rent out a theater, like you can book it for a birthday
Yeah.
party. So we would book it then, and our town has like a locally owned theater, and so we at like 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, we would do a movie, and it's sensory friendly because you turn the lights up and you turn the
Yep.
sound down. But also, everybody there understands that it's okay if somebody has to pop up and pace, or there's lots of noise reducing headphones.
Yep.
And so my husband, the pastor, would like get up at the beginning and welcome people and even give like a gospel message because we're kind of on mission all the time. We
Yeah.
know that we are serving families that may never come to church on a
Right.
Sunday. So we want to just make sure they know that we care for them, whether they're part of our family or not. And so being able to speak the gospel over them at events like that, making a email group so that you're
Mhm.
like we kinda at the movies, registration's easy. We're just getting names and email addresses, and then those email addresses go on our list of events that are specific to disability
Right.
ministry. So when we have 2 options for Vacation Bible School. We have inclusive options and a specialized option, and so we're letting them know about that because they're on our email list. So it's just kind of
Wow.
you kinda think of a funnel and just the next step that you want these families to take and make it as easy as you
Mhm.
can to keep inviting them and making things accessible.
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm thinking about from a kids ministry leader perspective is especially like I am only part-time, but I know there's a lot of people who are in the full-time ministry role and they're kind of thinking through like their annual events, right? 2026 is right around the corner and people are planning their annual events. And a lot of the events that you're saying don't necessarily, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but don't necessarily need to be special needs or disability families only. Because I can imagine that there's some kids ministry leaders who are like, "Oh, I just don't have the capacity to do another event, to do another thing, to have this specific of an event and I just don't have extra people or volunteers or all the things. But things like family pictures and what comes to mind a lot is often like big Easter egg hunts or different things like that where they do a here's an inclusive Easter egg hunt where it's designed just for kids like this. And so have you seen a lot of ministry leaders, especially in that average size church, do bigger things that also create space for all kids and families? Where for you, I feel like it just is naturally like, oh, we're a part of this community. It kind of it's like some things that you think of creative things all the time because you want to provide a space for all the people that you know and the community that you have. I don't know. That wasn't really a big question, but just of how do people find the tension as kids ministry leaders of wanting to serve this community, but also there's finding the balance between the families that they do have, the outreach component, the wanting to serve all families. I don't know. How do you find the
Yeah,
balance?
that's a lot. Yeah, it feels like a lot, doesn't it? I think a
Yeah.
big part of it is like the language that we usually use is either inclusive or accessible. And
Uh-huh.
so at most normal sized churches, your goal is to make your whatever you're doing more accessible or more
Yeah.
inclusive. And so you're going to take some smaller steps some examples of that we do Like, we have trained buddies, and we
Mhm.
have buddies in our classrooms. Sometimes they're matched with a specific child, or sometimes they're just kinda there. I have, like, a buddy training video on my website, so that's what we use and other churches use, and it's just kind of a, "Hey, here's where if we're here's the signs of sensory overload for a kid,"
Yeah.
right? And so our buddies carry, like, cinch backpacks, and they have tools in that backpack like noise reducing headphones, fidgets, a visual schedule, which is just, like, can be like a strip of
Mhm.
paper, and it's different icons, and it just shows the kids what's happening now and what's happening next. Visual timers, which you can get big ones and the whole
Mhm.
classroom can see it, or smaller ones that fit in your bag. So kids who, like, if you're saying, okay, you can play for 5 more minutes, well, not every kid knows what 5 more minutes
Right.
is. So we set that timer and they can see that. So all of these things are just small ways that we adjust the typical environment to make it more
Mhm.
welcoming and
Yeah.
easier. So at our church, we say that you qualify for the disability ministry if you need changes to the environment or changes to the curriculum in order to hear, understand, and respond to the gospel.
Mhm.
And so we're looking for environmental triggers, but we're also looking for, are there ways we need to adjust the curriculum? Like, my older son David has dyslexia. And so there were things like at church he couldn't do because he
Mhm.
couldn't spell the words to fill in the blanks or do the crossword puzzles, and so he would kind of shut down on that until we trained the teachers and said, "Okay, can you provide a list of the words, a word bank, right? Can you, instead of filling out the sheet, can they whisper the answer to the adult
Yeah.
that's standing close to them or the teenage buddy if that's what they have?" And so you just kind of think, what accommodations can we make? What is our goal? What is our learning goal? And how can we kind
Mhm.
of change some of the things so that every child gets to reach that goal? And sometimes those are environmental changes, expectation changes on our part, and then sometimes curriculum changes. We're just kind of watching out for kids who show signs of struggling, asking questions, ask their parents. What we like to say, what works at home and school? Here's what we're
Yeah.
seeing. Here's the behavior or the challenge we're seeing. Are you seeing this at home? And what helps at home or school to diminish it? And you can do that. You don't even have to have a diagnosis, right? To
Right.
see that a child is struggling. And so you can ask that question without saying, "We know your child has ADHD," or even
Right. You don't
use
have
that
to
language.
diagnose their child for them. Right.
Yeah, you just kind of say what works at home and school so that we can better support your child while he or she is at church.
Mhm. Yeah, literally just had a conversation this past Sunday with the mom, and I said those same words of like, "Hey, we want to learn more about your child. What is working at home? What conversations are you having? How like what's helping at school?" And it was so great. And I think the mom was so grateful for the way that I approached her and just
Yeah,
how I was like, "Hey, I want to help our volunteers create a space where your son doesn't feel like it's hard or doesn't feel like he's constantly getting corrected. And because that's not fun. It's not fun to go to church and constantly being like, no, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. You stop this, stop
right.
this.
Yeah,
And I was like, I want to help our volunteers get to know who your child is. And I think that's at the core of everything is we just want to get to know who these kids are and how God made them so that they can thrive and hear and respond to the gospel. And so I think it is helpful to have a conversation. I'm curious from your experience as you've worked alongside kids ministry leaders, this part of the ministry can be really hard because sometimes parents are more willing to share and then sometimes they're not willing to share or they don't want to share, they don't know what to share or there's shame involved there. And I remember being really young in ministry, being in my early 20s and just fumbling through this conversation with parents all the time.
yeah,
And you wrote this was like a very small portion of your book, but you kind of hint at like how many kids have IEPs in school and of like I had a thought that I was like, "Oh, is would this be helpful to have an individual education plan at church. And I was like, I don't even know. What does that even look like? And so, as you encourage kids ministry leaders to navigate this conversation with families, what are some things that you encourage kids ministry leaders to do or to say as they're talking to families?
Yeah, we actually do have an what we call I call in the book an ISP, an individualized spiritual plan. I've worked with Lifeway on it, and they call it an individualized discipleship plan. So
Okay.
ISP or IDP, they're the same concept. And what I did for Lifeway is we created a rubric and we broke down different categories. So, like, let's say the goal is scripture memory. Well, not everybody can do that in the exact same way, but here's 6 different ways they could do it. And so you can get your volunteers together, the family, the parents, if they're interested in this, and say, hey, we want to disciple your child. Like, that's our goal.
Mhm.
We're not just here to babysit, we want to disciple. And so we have a goal of scripture memory, and here's what that can look like for your child. And so the parents can be part of that conversation. And so you just kind of adjust it. Like, for example, and this is kind of, I mean, this is for my son James, who's mostly nonverbal, but one of the ways that we adjust that for him is we get these recordable buttons. You can get them on Amazon or lots of different places. And so if you're talking about a memory verse, we can record parts of that memory verse on these buttons, and then he
Mm.
hits the buttons and he can put those in order. And so that's a way that he still meets that goal of
Yeah.
scripture memory. And so there's just lots of really creative ways that you can do that. I think a big part of this conversation with parents is that we're asking them to be really vulnerable with us,
Right.
right? Like there's things that happen in their houses and they're scared to tell ministry leaders about. It
Mhm.
could be because they've had negative past experiences in churches, they've been kicked out of churches, or they drop their kid off every Sunday and 10 minutes later they're getting that text, "Hey, you got to come back. We just, you know."
Yeah.
So, if we can meet that vulnerability with kindness and empathy and asking really good questions and helping them feel like we're on the same team with them
Mhm.
instead of against. I mean, you just think of they fight battles in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Sometimes they feel like they're fighting the school district, or they're fighting with insurance, or they're fighting for at the hospital. And so if church can be a place that they don't have to fight, if they
Mhm.
feel like we're on the same team, and I think those ISPs, IDPs, I think that helps kind of build that bridge to say, we want to learn from you as the
Yeah.
expert in your child. We want to know how to help him or her reach these goals. And then we kind of even have some goals on there that are behavior kind of goals. And so how do we support positive behavior choices for this
Mhm.
child? Because that's really one of the emails that I get most often, on Monday morning or Thursday morning after the midweek chaos, right? I mean, we can kind of
Yeah.
call midweek chaos is we have this one kid
Right.
and he doesn't fit into our ministry we don't know what to do. We don't know how to
Yeah.
help him do this. And so some of that behavior support can be really helpful and just kind of analyze. We call it the ABCs of behavior. So it's the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And so we say this is like a behavior therapy
Mhm.
standard. And so you
Okay.
look at the behavior, and if you're trying to support a behavior change, you look at what comes before, that's the
Mhm.
antecedent, or what comes after, the consequence, and you as the adult change one of those, and that can change the behavior. And so we can't always double down on getting bossier or
Right.
stricter. Sometimes we have to say, okay, how can we change what's coming before or what's coming after? And then that child can more easily change the behavior.
Mhm. Yeah, you even talk about that in your book, it was the invitation part where you, like, help kids, like, you invite them to do something and you either are, like, setting a timer and you're redirecting them or moving them from one thing to another thing, and I think oh, it's the expectation.
Yeah.
Was it invitation, expectation?
Invitation and expectation, yeah.
Yeah, and just I think that is super helpful. Like, I even wrote it down as something that I can tell my volunteers on Sunday during a huddle of like, hey, most kids cannot go automatically from small group to large group and then back to small group.
Yeah.
And so, what does it look like for us to have this posture throughout our entire morning of an invitation and then an expectation? And I just think for all kids, when kids have the expectation clearly communicated, they do so much better.
Yeah.
It's just like, "Oh, I know what I'm supposed to be doing," instead of living in this vague, like, "Can I lay down? Should I sit up? Should I
Yeah.
poke my neighbor? Where should I sit?" Like, all of these
Mhm.
things, having this expectation is so incredibly helpful. And I think those ABCs could potentially really change how someone does Sunday morning in
Yeah.
just a couple days of let's change one of those things. Is the consequence not is it too hard of a consequence? Are we not giving them enough space to finish a task and then move on to something else? And how are we communicating? Is our tone too harsh? Like all of these things are really helpful to think through as you're trying to create a really special learning environment for kids. And so that's was so like I'm just my brain is like often like that was so incredibly helpful as I'm thinking through just all the different kids that we have on Sunday. Um I want to shift gears a little bit because you have a chapter in your book that kind of talks about what happens after kids ministry and what happens when they graduate out. And I was telling you before we hit record that I saw this question pop up multiple times just this week in the kids ministry Facebook groups of I have this kid. He's technically, like physically, he looks like an eighth grader, but spiritually and developmentally, he's not an eighth grader. And so he doesn't fit in students or he can't be in students. Where does he go? And so I would love to hear your wisdom on how do we support these families as they graduate out of kids ministry and for safety reasons can't, or maybe it's within kids ministry. A fifth grader can't be with a 2-year-old. And so what does
Right.
that look like in that environment to help families as their kids continue to grow?
Yeah, I think this is great. I think this is such a helpful framework because kids with disabilities become teens with disabilities who become
Mhm.
adults with disabilities, right? Like they don't stop. So a couple solutions like if our kids in the kids ministry, if we think they can do well in student ministry, youth ministry with help from a buddy, then we continue that. So we kind of take those modifications that we've been doing in children's ministry that transfers over to the student ministry staff. We like to say that in student ministry, that support becomes even more invisible. And
Mm.
so they are, the buddy might be close, but they're kind of like, they're fading their support. So they're trying to increase independence. That works for some kids, some kids. If that doesn't work, like my son James, there is no amount of modifications we could make to a youth group environment where he would feel not just, but also he's not going to understand the gospel in that
Right.
environment. But like
Yeah.
he's not going to under the teaching also doesn't meet his needs. And so what we've done at our church is we've created a reverse inclusion class. And so we have a class of teenagers and young adults because in our school, well, in most school districts, kids with disabilities can go to school until they're 22. And so they might move into this class as teenagers and then they'll stay in it until they transition into the adult class. So the room is designed to meet their needs. So, like in
Mhm.
our room, there is a train table because we have teenagers in this room that they still like a train table. They like to play with that. There's a trampoline because my James is going to jump on that trampoline the whole time he's in there. The curriculum is designed for him. We use All
Yeah.
in Wonder curriculum that Courtney Jenkins makes, and so this class uses that curriculum. So it's tailored for them, but we invite typical teenagers to come in, not to be buddies, but to be friends. And
Mhm.
so they might sign up for one Sunday a month or two Sundays a month. And so that's that reverse inclusion part of it is that the environment and the curriculum are designed with their needs in mind, but they still can form friendships with other
Yeah.
teenagers because they're coming in. And a lot of high schools have, I think our high school calls it the PALS program, and so you have like PALS PE or PALS choir where it's
Mm.
designed for the kids with disabilities and then the typical kids come in and that they serve in that way or that's one of,
Yeah.
they get a credit for that. And so it's happening in our high school and our junior high and so we're just kind of using that at church and it's worked really well. My older son went to college and like he served in our disability ministry and his friends served and he's gone off to college and his friends are still serving in James's class as as kind of
That's so cute.
their friends and I just love it. It like they walk into church on so James's class, the inclusive or the reverse inclusion class they come to the service for the music, and then they go back to their class for the lesson.
Okay.
And so their friends are coming in with them. The typical teenagers, they're walking in with them, sitting with them, making sure they have their noise reducing headphones and fidgets if they need them. And then they're going back to their class for their lesson. But they're still getting the social interaction with other teenagers, but everything else just better fits their needs. And we call it the RISE class. So it stands
Mhm.
for Reverse Inclusion Serves Everyone. Because all of our adult classes have a name, the
Yeah.
whatever kind of different classes. And so that's what we named that class.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that. I love that they just I don't know. I'm like, "Oh, that's great. I love that." I think that's so sweet. The invitation of typical kids and high school kids to be a part of that. I don't know. That's just where you learn, and especially as teenagers, you develop a deeper understanding for God as creator.
Hmm.
And the concept of how everyone is made in the image of God. And I just feel like as a teenager to come face to face with that core doctrine in such a beautiful way is so impactful for
Yeah.
them as they go into their schools and interact with other kids, and even as they become adults and go to college and all of the things, like having that foundation of like, oh, I know deep in my bones that everyone was created in the image of God and everyone was created on purpose for a purpose because of what I experienced as a teenager and the people that I got to meet and the lessons that I've learned from all sorts of different people. And I just think that's so beautiful and really how the church should function.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just becomes this like amazing community for all families and all people. And so I love that. I
Yeah.
have one more question and then we'll get to our final question. But sometimes ministry leaders, or like you kind of were talking about this earlier, of how sometimes families feel like they are fighting to be included in church. And you have a unique perspective because you're married to the pastor. And
Yeah.
so, and this is, you get to create these environments because you want your own children to feel included. And I would love for you to speak to if a kids ministry leader is trying to lead up in this space and cast vision for their senior leadership. Maybe it's for a bigger budget or a room or curriculum that's extra cost or just all these resources that come with serving these families. Maybe the kids ministry leader is coming across all these families, getting to know all these families and trying to help senior leadership understand the importance of putting resources behind this. What has been helpful to communicate and to say as kids ministry leaders are having this conversation with senior leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it comes back to what you were saying, even about how we're discipling teenagers to see all
Mhm.
people as made in the image of God. I think all good disability ministry starts with a theology of disability. So, what does the
Yeah.
Bible say about people with disabilities? And what does the Bible show us about how we should treat people with disabilities? And I think this is going to continue to set Christ followers apart from the world. I mean, like,
Mhm.
really, like, how can our churches be a more loving and place, a more welcoming place than anywhere else that these families could find? And so when we're
Yeah.
talking to senior leadership, when we're talking to lead pastors, sometimes they can kind of think of a return on investment, or,
Right.
like, and that's not the economy, that it's not kingdom economy. There's
Mhm.
just ways, like, you think about the parable of the great banquet in Luke 14. And it even says, you're going to be blessed. So Jesus is telling a parable, and there's a guy, and he's throwing a banquet, and he invites all these people, and none of them can come. So he tells his servant, go out and invite the blind and the lame, invite them into this banquet. And so they're the ones who come. And then he says, we've started with these people, and yet there's room for more. And so it
Yeah.
said, like, Jesus kind of says, he's giving an example of what the kingdom will look like, right? Like, you
Yeah.
think he's talking to the Pharisees, you think that they're all going to look and talk and act like you, but you're going to be surprised when you get to
Mhm.
heaven and there's more diversity than you anticipate. So how can we now make our churches look like what heaven will look like? And so part of that is saying, let's make room for people with disabilities. Let's make these accommodations. And I think kind of the mind shift that needs to happen is we're not trying to fit kids with disabilities into this existing structure. Can we
Right.
create an existing structure that already welcomes those kids, right? It's much
Yeah.
easier. That's what the parable teaches us. Like, we're inviting them to the banquet, and then there's room for everybody. So you think of like a
Mhm.
visual schedule, like we talked about. Well, you can have that in your buddy bag that just that one kid uses, or you can put it up on the board and everybody can see it and
Yeah.
everybody can benefit from seeing first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And so kind of thinking of those subtle things that may not cost money or may not even add new volunteers that you can start doing. And then part of it, I think, on these families, if you have a family and they keep coming and they're successful, have them write a letter, have them talk about the
Mm.
benefits of coming to church, have them talk about the other families that they know that want to come to church and they can't. We tell, if I'm talking to a family and the family is trying to go to church and the church isn't making changes, we say, then invite the pastor over for dinner. Show the pastor what life is like at your
Yeah.
house at dinner. And then he has to like look at you and say, no, we're not
Mhm.
going to make room for mom,
Right.
dad, kid with disabilities, and siblings. It's much harder to do when you know each other, when you're in community
Totally.
with each other. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I feel like that was kind of a lot of different solutions, but hopefully people can kind of pick something out of that and say, okay, I'm going to start by changing this environment so that all kids are more welcome in some really low cost ways. Then I'm going to take this one family that we have and share their story with the whole
Mhm.
church and with leadership. And then if it's the family that's listening, they can say, how do I educate more
Yeah.
people at this church about the challenges we face and how, I mean, the gospel is fills the hole that every
Yeah.
family has. And so you think of just all those families out there, and that's the piece that they're missing. It's going to
Mhm.
change generations of their family.
Yeah.
And so that feels worth it to to shift
Totally.
the budget around or make some changes and just make a more accessible environment for families.
Mhm. I love that. Okay, Sandra, the last question we always ask, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit because I want you to give some encouragement to the kids ministry leader who this is brand new for them. They have no history, education, knowledge when it comes to serving these families. What is like a practical first step other than reading your book?
That's a great first step. I love that. You know, I we had a children's minister who had just come out of college and she was hired at our church, and there was a Wednesday night that I happened to be at church walking by and I see her and she's just crying. She's just bawling, right? And I'm
Oh
like,
no.
oh, you know what? I mean, Wednesday nights are hard. Like, she's probably not the only one who's ever left a Wednesday night crying. And so when I thought about this question, and I just thought, what did she need to hear? And I think part of it is not believing there's no answers out there. You have to figure it out all by yourself, and there's
Mm,
no resources to help. Like, what I told her in that moment is, it is hard. What you're doing is hard. You're trying to serve families and disciple kids and lead them through salvation conversations and help all of this is hard, but you don't have to do it by yourself. There's a
mhm,
team around you, your pastoral staff, your volunteers who have been there for a long time. Lean on them, but also there's resources out there, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to feel like you're the first one to ever say, how do I include a child with autism, right? Like, I ask
right.
chat gpt questions like that all the time. Hey, this is what do I do here? How does this work? And the questions are pretty good. I mean, the answers are
Mhm,
pretty good. And so I think it's kind of accepting your own vulnerability and saying,
yeah,
I'm not expected to be superwoman here. I'm not expected
mhm,
to do this perfectly. So I need to invite people in to help me, to pray for me, to answer these questions. And then I need to invite other people to be vulnerable with me. So if you're having those conversations like you talked about with these families, it's vulnerability meeting vulnerability. Let's figure
mhm,
this out together. And I think that can really, if you just start with kind of a place of vulnerability and openness and willingness, God can really show off in those
Yeah.
moments, and really guide you to what you need, the right conversation at the right time, the right question pops in your head when you're talking to that family, just being open to the help that you may need and don't think that it all falls on you.
Yeah. I love that so much. Thanks so much for sharing, Sandra. Where can people find you? I'm going to link your book in the show notes so people can get the book, but where you mentioned a website.
Mhm.
So why don't you share with people where they can find you or learn more from your resources?
Okay, so it's sandrapeoples.com, pretty easy to find. The
Yep.
book has a website, accessible-church, and like for every chapter, there's more resources that go along with each chapter. I'm
Love
going to
that.
continue to update those. So, like on my website, there's a registration form. Hey, I need to know what questions do I ask if a family's coming for the first time. You can find that on
Mhm.
there. You can find that buddy training video. There's links to a Pinterest board with ideas for a sensory space. There's an Amazon list of children's books that you may want to add to your children's ministry so they learn more about disabilities. And so all of those tools, like if somebody asks me a question, I create the resource and I put it on the
Yeah.
website. And so
Great.
that's hopefully a one place to stop and use that search bar and see if you can find what you need.
Awesome. I love that so much. We'll link your website in the show notes as well. Sandra, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.